Madam Chair, in the 1990s, the Palestinian people elected Hamas as the political party and political leaders to rule their state. But when they were asked for recognition by the United States deliberately dismissed them as a terrorist organization and defied and totally ignored the will of the people of these people. And what's important is that Hamas said that they would actually recognize Israel as a state and push for a two-state solution. But the United States policy of doing that actively led to further terrorism and further deaths of people within the United States as well as within Palestine. We also see the United States, Madam Speaker, during the past 50 years has supported 72 dictators in Africa, in the Middle East, and whatnot. And that has also led to hundreds of thousands of people dying under oppressive regimes. And this was simply a contract made because the United States wanted to exert their influence in all countries around the world. And as a result of that, you see a lot of civil rights, civil movements, but in addition to that, you also see a lot of terrorist organizations being born exactly in response to the United States policies, Madam Speaker. Policies that other Western countries collectively also supported. That's why we have a lot of terrorist organizations that are fighting against Western countries, Madam Speaker. If anyone is to blame because of terrorist organizations like terrorist attacks, we are to blame to a large extent, Madam Speaker. That's why we think that we should take the initiative of acknowledging that we have done wrong, by acknowledging that they do have just causes, and therefore revisit whether the policies that we're currently enacting are correct to begin with. We on site government strongly believe that terrorism should not be justified in the media, as in killing people and innocent civilians. That's not something that the media should necessarily support. What we do support, we should criticize that, but what we do support is arguing that they do have just grievances and just causes by analyzing what actually happened and explaining why we are to held accountable. And in this sense, we're going to argue that our policy of Western media is actively portraying these things as just causes will lead to a lot of great benefits, not only to citizens within the United States or Western countries, but also contribute to peace and security around the world. So let's first look into the question of what the problem is in the status quo. We tell you, Madam Speaker, they're currently in the status quo, the media is extremely biased. It's extremely biased to the point that every single media outlet talks about how Hamas, the PLA, the RA, how these organizations are all just evil, wrong organizations, right? That simply kill people. And on that kind of situation, the reason why that usually happens is because they're either lobbied by Israeli supporters, and additionally because it's extremely easy for the media to sell this kind of narrative to the people, whereas telling the real story as to why they're doing that seems anti-American, right? Which is why I think but Madam Speaker, we think that the media has an important duty not to just make money, but also to inform people in the right direction, of informing people of why things happen, and whether, based on an analysis of what's happening, whether they do have a just cause or not. We think that narrative is currently missing in the status quo because they actively tell people to deny, because they don't simply inform people of these important things, and they tell them not to even consider these things, and actively tell them in this kind of way. We think this leads to a couple of problems. Number one, citizens become extremely biased and simply portray them as wrong people without understanding why they're doing it. And even if they do understand why, they are not given adequate information as to why it's a just cause. But secondly, we also say this is the bigger problem. It leads to citizens promoting and supporting politicians and organizations that actively further entrench the problem. In other words, they don't support politicians that support addressing the core cause of the problem. For example, we say that a two-state solution is something that is a viable option that both states want, but the reason why citizens don't support that is because in the media, they don't talk about that, right? Because everyone in the media supports pro-Israel stance, right? It's something that is actively propagated by the media, right? The United States, for example, doesn't recognize Palestine as a state, right? And that's easy to do by the United States because the citizens themselves are biased in this kind of way, which we think is a significant problem.
The motion says that you also have to portray them as criminals. How are we going to portray them as criminals if we're not going to show all the killing and the human rights violations that they're committing? Answer your burden and stop pussyfooting.
Here. Pussy what?
Pussyfooting.
Okay, I would not pussyfoot anymore. Look, a lot of our heroes and the people that we cherish when it comes to the American Revolution, and a lot of our people who fought for independence, they were also terrorists, right? We think there's a fundamental difference between supporting an act of violence and supporting the just cause, right? And that's the thing that we want to do, and we want to be very clear about that. Okay, so in this kind of situation, as I simply argued, we think that this leads. There are a number of benefits when citizens are informed and also persuaded of the just cause. We think number one, citizens become extremely acquainted and know the facts and the reasons why they're committing terrorists, and they get to analyze as to what's actually going on. For example, they get to understand that Hamas, for example, are fighting back because the Israeli soldiers are kidnapping children, right? They get to understand that the Israeli government is actively dislocating people and building houses in areas that they shouldn't be, right? They're not going back to the 1967 border, for example. And in this situation, citizens understand the rationale as to why they're doing it. No, thank you. Secondly, we also say that people can additionally empathize now with the causes. That's a narrative, and that's a thing that is totally impossible in the status quo with every single media outlet. Talks about that. We now get to know that rendition is happening, right? When we torture terrorists. We get to know that we're also torturing innocent people. We get to know that we also support dictators, which is why a lot of these causes are caused by us. And as a result, the citizens become much more informed of these kind of things. So why is that important? We think that in order for the government to enact policies that actually push for change, for example, the United States government pushing for change in a way saying, Israel, we no longer support your policies, and we think it's about time we now discuss the two-state solution. These kinds of pressures don't exist, but these can exist when the citizens increasingly support these kinds of movements within their country. When politicians say, I believe in a two-state solution, when they say, we don't think we should be supporting dictators, that kind of rhetoric is increasingly popular under a paradigm, under a setting where citizens are able to empathize and logically understand those kinds of arguments in the first place. And in that sense, we think this will lead to, in the long, we're not saying this will happen immediately, but in the long run, it creates a room for development that makes it, the environment much more amenable towards peace. Final point, we think that terrorist organizations would have lacked the incentive to attack citizens. Right now, they associate citizens as the government and the government as their citizens. When the media and the citizens themselves actively say that we understand your grievances, this takes away a huge chunk of justification for terrorist organizations to attack innocent civilians, because those are the people that they need to persuade in order to render change for their own societies. We're very proud to propose.
Making a sentence derogatory in terms that you're a coward, you're a pussy, you're a all.
Madam Speaker, we're fine with identifying the causes of terrorism. We're not fine with the Western media identifying these causes as just causes, because we see side governments taking extremely soft stance in today's space, in which they only want to defend the Hamas and in fact portray the Hamas in such a positive light. Today's debate, Madam Speaker, should be about comparing the costs and the actions, whether the act of terrorism can be justified by the cost of it. And no, we don't understand the grievances of Al-Qaeda. No, we don't understand the grievances of ISIS. And that's precisely the stance that we want to stand for on side opposition in today's debate. Before we move on into our constructive arguments, let's first break down their case one by one. The first thing that side government told us in today's debate is that terrorist organizations sometimes have incentives against the United States, that sometimes they have just grievances. First of all, Madam Speaker, they failed to answer the premise of today's debate. How can these actions of terrorism be justified when the very act of committing terrorism itself is a crime? And this is an important clarification that we want to make on side opposition, because we think that terrorist organizations and portraying them in a positive light or informing the public about them is fundamentally different from the terrorist actions that they commit against the United States or whatever Western state we want to talk about. We think that the only thing that side government effectively accomplishes in today's debate is ultimately incentivizing these terrorist organizations to commit more terrorist actions, because now they realize that the Western media is indeed going to portray them in a positive light. And in fact, when they talk about organizations such as the Hamas, in fact, when they talk about controversial solutions such as the two-state solution, Madam Speaker, we in fact don't want the Hamas to commit these terrorist organizations. We want them to negotiate and talk with the United States, other Western states, and we think that this fundamentally harms that legal framework, as I'm going to elaborate later on. The second thing that they told us here is that the media should be able to inform the citizens. First of all, Madam Speaker, we want to emphasize that providing information is mutually exclusive from the idea of portraying them as just causes. Because why do we have to portray it as just? Why not just explain the causes, Madam Speaker? When they talk about the two-state solution, I recently read an entire fact sheet that CFR and BBC published on it, and they actually exist on the internet, fully accessible to the public. And of course, Madam Speaker, we never think that terrorism always has a cause behind it. We don't think that all of these terrorist organizations are political terrorists to begin with. We oftentimes believe that organizations such as the Al-Qaeda and ISIS operate for the single purpose and the only goal of harming citizens and harming the interests of Western states. And this nicely leads us on into our constructive case. No thank you. Let's first move on into our argument about why this actually goes against the role of Western media and why that's harmful in terms of disabling us from combating propaganda. Madam Speaker, we want to emphasize the role that Western media plays in shaping public perception, because we think that the Western media is ultimately an extension of the state. There's a reason why we have the term fourth estate. It's because it represents the stance of the country, it represents the actions, the potential actions that the country can take. We point to the example of BBC Russia, which was directly created and funded by the government to encounter Russia's propaganda during the Cold War. We also give to you the example of our Radio Free Asia, which was used to combat North Korean propaganda and was funded by the United States. All of these have a specific purpose to combat things that were ultimately deemed harmful by the government to our own citizens and to the world in general. And the reason why we do that is because we have a specific purpose to serve, and because we need an accountable media to counter the various types of propaganda that these terrorist organizations are going to want our citizens to believe in. We think that first of all, it's extremely important to recognize that these people, the citizens of our own country, are the targets of propaganda. And the reason why we believe that political and terrorist propaganda is becoming so effective is because we think that we already see that trend in the status quo, in which we see the ISIS or Al-Qaeda accumulating political capital and accumulating members, recruiting them through releasing things like beheading videos on YouTube or releasing documentaries regarding the so-called positive actions that they commit against these Western states. No, thank you. We think that this makes the recruiting process extremely effective. They're also able to, in the process, accomplish the goal of justifying their very own actions. Even in the case of political terrorism, Madam Speaker, we think that allowing them to recruit more and more members from our society is extremely harmful, because the mechanisms that they use to recruit are no longer rational anymore the moment they start committing terrorism, the moment they start resorting to violence against civilians, Madam Speaker. That is also the reason why we think that for citizens of our country, terrorist attacks and the commission of terrorist attacks also suddenly becomes much more appealing. Even in the case of domestic terrorism, which they simply refuse to respond to, we think that things like the Boston Marathon attack, once the government portrays that as positive actions, once the government says that there was a just cause behind something that absolutely had no just cause, Madam Speaker, this is ultimately going to change public sentiment in a way that is in support of the propaganda that these terrorist organizations support. No, thank you. So ultimately what we tell you is that by the media supporting this propaganda, it harms the country's firm stance against terrorism, Madam Speaker. It harms our stance that terrorism is unacceptable under every single circumstance, and we think that this ultimately goes against the role of Western media as well. So let's move on into our second argument. Before that, NC.
Okay, but someone was victims of a rapist, and then he kills the rapist, right? Then I have a great justified cause to hate that, criminals, but I did something wrong in the actions. Why that's not possible?
First of all, you need to actually explain to us as to why that example can be equated to terrorism in the first place, because none of these terrorists were raped. Sometimes none of these terrorists were actually attacked by Western governments to begin with. Sometimes they tried to blow up their own causes and over-exaggerated and therefore disproportionately respond to that as well. But second of all, even if we say that that was true, we think that terrorism and murder is never an appropriate way to respond to it. We think that as a media, even under that circumstance, should explain the reason why the person committed that act, not necessarily defending the act of murder. Let's move on to our second argument. While legitimizing terrorism can never be justified, A, we think that media should function within the legal framework of the country. The media should encourage the usage of legal means, because outside of the legal framework that the government has set for them, we think that the media is dead, because you're open to government censorship, you're open to the citizens' criticism. And why does supporting terrorism ultimately go against that legal framework, Mr. Speaker? We think that there are various measures that the government currently puts in place. For example, negotiations or political talks with these terrorist organizations. And we think that these are the most effective mechanisms that we need to resort to as a state, instead of justifying and actually saying that these actions were just in the first place. And we believe that by the media supporting this propaganda, it ultimately goes against that legal framework, because it's supporting things that the government is unwilling to support, i.e. terrorism. But furthermore, we think that the act of supporting that cruelty itself is never justified. Because by garnering political support for terrorists that are out of order, we think that the victimized civilians, are those who committed a cruelty, are basically defended against the victimized civilians. And by vindicating terrorist Madam Speaker, we think that we're victimizing the victims again, that this builds a distrust against the state, that this ultimately disallows individuals from expressing their angst against these terrorist organizations, when in fact they've killed thousands of innocent civilians, and we point to the example of 9/11. For all of these reasons, we never want to justify terrorism, and we're more than proud to oppose.
Now I understand why the Kim government should be in because we must educate people like her and him and him. They said media should be a puppet of the government. That is why when government was strong stance against terrorist organization, then we shouldn't say terrorist organization can be justified. More than that, she said all the terrorists doesn't have any justifiable cause. No, that's not true. If I am living in the Middle Eastern countries and suddenly US drone comes to my villages and kill my daughters, my neighbors, my parents, then probably I'm going to be pissed off, right? Then I might take a terrorist organization act. Maybe that action is wrong. The media can say you shouldn't kill the civilians of our countries. But media also portray maybe US government drone system is also wrong because these people have a justifiable cause. That is the thing we want to propose in today's debate. Rather than everybody saying terrorist organization is bad, we don't want to live in that world because of high Hello Asia stuff. It's not good thing to do because the media should be independent. The media should provide the biased and balanced information rather than biased information, right? With that, I have one argument. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why current media legitimate the human rights abuse of the terrorists by the government and further harms of that idea. And before we move to my first argument, I have a couple of responses, right? We don't understand what is the role of the media. Media shouldn't be prepared and controlled by the government. Media should provide a lot of good information. But currently, even if media wants to provide balanced information, people hate it. That is why media cannot say maybe that terrorist and terrorist organization has a good justifiable cause, right? We think that's the problem. Why? Because this goes against the responsibility of the media. My first clip said US and Western media was the cause of the problem. When US or Western country was silenced, when Western government caused the problem by putting more dictators, right? Like putting more money and putting more power in Israel and allow them to kill the citizens in Palestine, right? When they silence and they cause the problems, they also have a responsibility to solve the problem in the status quo, right? We don't have any response from them. And what is the problems of biased information? Also proposed by many arguments from my prime minister. No response whatsoever. Response wins the debate. God should win more, right? We think fight against terrorist organization is not easy. But blindly hatred and blaming, branding as a cock-sucking bad motherfucker doesn't solve any problems. Why? Because we should address the core of the problems, right? If you can say Israel might be the cause of the problem, Palestine is bad, Israel might be the cause of the problem, then we can push the ideas of the two-state solution, right? When US media says Palestine kills a lot of Israeli citizens, any justifiable cause, it is not easy to deny and oppose the ideas of military aid provided by the US government. It creates more terrorist organization within the countries, right? More than that, if we believe the terrorist organization is bad, it's evil, then US government cannot give up certain benefit for the solution, cannot give up certain benefit even if there is a core solution of terrorist organization, because we are giving something to the evil organization, right? Bush always said no negotiation. We don't think that is a good tactic fighting against terrorist organization. More than that, this is the no response from Kang. More radicalization. Currently terrorists can attack US citizens because we said US government equals US citizens. Nobody talked about our great cause. But the moment the media and citizen made the media outlet says maybe this is the good cause, they lose their justification and narrative, right? But more than that, if we can hear more their cause, more their cases, they lose their incentive, make more trouble, killing more citizens. Because they said, because I want you to hear my voices, that is why I'm killing innocent citizens, right? But they don't have to do that because their purpose is getting achieved under our policy. But more than that, now the problem is the US citizens, not even non-US citizens. All the US citizens who has origins of Middle Eastern countries and Chechen is pissed off. Why? Because every media said US, father, your grandfather, your grandmother is bad. But if the media can say maybe they have a good justified cause, US citizen doesn't have to be pissed off. They don't have to make same terrorist act like Boston Marathon, the terrorist organization. The shoes, something, right? I think that's all. And then the Kang's argument was very simple. Media, there is a legal framework. We shouldn't violate the legal framework. No, you are violating the legal framework. Everybody has the freedom of speech, right? If I want to glorify the killer, then I can. I don't think where the legal framework we are violating. I think your second speaker must be justified. But more than that, there's not a no local media in the democratic society. No local media must provide balanced information. The media must provide counter narrative when government is doing stupid stuff. That is why we propose this motion. Yes.
So if you're proposing that Western media should just provide just causes, where is the balance there? And especially if in the status quo if we're already accessible.
Okay, because no, that's not the case. Most of the terrorist organization is not a popped up organization, right? There is a historical cause. US government attacked the Middle East country. Soviet Union attacked the Middle East country. That is why they are Al-Qaeda, right? What about Hamas? Because Israeli people rape your mother and sons and daughters every day. That is why they are doing this stupid stuff. That is why we can't say that. But people like the brave, they don't have any justifiable cause. That we don't have to say they have a justifiable cause when they don't have any justifiable cause, right? I don't think there's a burden of the government. Look at the burden. The second lesson, Gaeun and Minjae. So let's move on to my last questions. Why there is a problem? We think the biggest problems of depicting terrorists as the evil is, allowing government abuse the terrorists and Middle East people, right? Like the case of the Guantanamo Bay. In the freedom of countries, US, they still have a Guantanamo Bay. It's ridiculous. The reason why we can't have a Guantanamo Bay because we are depicting these people is not a human being, evil. Vampire. That is why we can still abuse them. We think this is wrong, right? If there's a balanced opinion, they can't because we must treat them as human beings. More than that, their policy creates a more terrorist organization, right? Because it radicalizes people from oppressed countries, right? If my son is in the Baguilat Bay and then the US prison guard, cut down the hand and then do something like sexual torture, if I hear that news, then I have a more reason to be pissed off and more radicalized, right? That is why we see more terrorist organizations. Their policy cannot solve any terrorist problem. Our policy can, because we can provide more balanced information and opinion for the sake of the country, for the sake of the media, for the sake of the Middle Eastern country, for the sake of the USA. We should propose this.
Madam Chair, I think it's rather bizarre for the affirmative defense to support the idea of a media trying to characterize terrorism as a means that it can actually use because it's justified by the cost that we actually have. In the light of ISIS, for example, which is recruiting a lot of people from all over the world, we do think that you're sending a wrong message and you're simply legitimizing it. That's a bad thing. And we don't think that the Hamas is actually the greatest context to which you can put this today's debate, because we don't think that's the greatest threat. But regardless, we do think that our case is still standing in today's debate. Let's take a look at the non-responsiveness of the entire affirmative bench towards the burden that they have to have. Because essentially, the Prime Minister came up here and talked about the idea that, hey, it's okay, the only thing that we're going to do today is come up with backgrounds in order for us to be able to know more about, like Hamas, the six-party housing, and what have you. Doesn't BBC come up with all these backgrounds already? Doesn't economists already have debates in their websites already? We don't think that the policy they have is so soft because it's always being done anyway. They're trying to skirt their burden. That's the reason why I told you guys are actually pussyfooting in today's debate. I've told you, ladies and gentlemen, that what you have to do is to come up with a portrayal of the method of these terrorists as something that's justified because of the particular cause. Conversely, what we're going to do in the negative bench is to show that regardless of actually what cause we have, we think that a method is something that's unjustified. Up until now, we weren't able to fulfill their burdens. That's the reason why I'm sorry, we're not going to be talking about today's debate. But as burden, ladies and gentlemen, is to show to us, to show them as criminals, that they commit violence, but they actually have to show that just causes justify their methods. Something which they themselves said that they're not going to do. But how are you going to portray them as criminals if you're not going to actually show them a lot of these killings that these groups are actually doing? So at the end of the day, they're forced to still defend the idea that they do have human rights violations to done. They have human rights violations and they're actually killing a lot of people. Moving on, I have two questions that I want to answer in today's debate, to which I'm going to integrate my rebuttals as well as my constructive. The first one is a question which MC asked. What is the role of Western media? We say that yes, media should not be a puppet. That's correct, it's true. Because it's the fourth estate, it's a check of balance in the state internally. But in Western media, we're talking about international media, right? So it's not simply about the relation of one state towards media in particular. Western media, in the international scope, becomes an extension of Western states. Just like, for example, what Gaeun talked about, the BBC BBC Russia become a counter-propaganda in Cold War. And a lot of actually the media in Iraq right now, which is funded by the US government, are actually used to as a propaganda against ISIS and Al-Qaeda back in 2011. We do think, therefore, that it's an important component of the state, because the main interest of Western media is also to protect its main stakeholders, who are the Western citizenry, who's also the biggest audience of these Western media anyway. But the second reason, but the second interest of the media is to also promote legal means, right, and not promote extra legal means. Why is this? The idea is that it's legal means largely because, media will only thrive within a legal framework. Outside of it, it will actually be weak because it can easily be censored when it's done by government. So it's the biggest protection against the state, against any form of restriction. That's the reason why it has to promote things like discussions, negotiations, and it shouldn't actually support the idea of terrorism. Because if terrorism is propagated, ladies and gentlemen, even for example in Israel or in Hamas, we think that there will be citizens of the West who will also be affected by it. Therefore, that's the reason why we have this step. We have to promote the legal means, ladies and gentlemen. They said that there are no legal means. That's not correct. Israel has negotiations. Hamas actually used elections instead of terrorism. That's what we're supporting. Instead of you going out and bombarding, like other countries, for example, with your weapons. Probably it's better for you to actually sit down and and use legal means in order for you to forward whatever cause that you have. But secondly, to say, even if, for example, you can't do these things, the threat that it has towards international order as well as the interest of the Western media, which is to protect the citizenry, is so grave that we can't even risk that, ladies and gentlemen. So we have to actually portray it to be the wrongest and the most, most infuriating method that you can possibly do in order to forward your cause. Yes.
You think it is justifiable if U.S. government is trying to, conceal the act of their,
Okay, sit down. It's not the U.S. government. I'm talking about the U.S. media here. It's a very big difference. Sit down. So how do you forward Western interests anyway? Essentially, the extension coming from affirmative bench is this. They said, sit down, stop badgering. They said that we have to stop condemning terrorism because it will only create the anti-Western sentiment. Essentially, this is the same case with NC Run, where he said, well, we're going to radicalize groups, ladies and gentlemen. This is completely a rehash of what the first speaker said. We say, as the first response to this, is that the depiction is generally objective anyway, because we also want to capture people to actually know the truth. We don't think that generally, it has an incentive to actually be biased to a certain extent. But in the event that it is, we say that what is actually being depicted is that the method itself is the one which actually are being condensed to begin with. But the second response against that, we don't think that there will be any marginal impact that they will have, regardless of the depiction. Even if, for example, the depiction will be better, it's not as if all these ISIS supporters will all of a sudden love the United States, right? Because it's deeply, because the particular resentment they have towards the US is deeply rooted from the US military occupation, which can't simply be redressed by any new depiction that actually have in their side of the house. But even if, for example, let's assume, even if anti-Western sentiment is deepened, we say that's only deepened amongst the radicals themselves, right? We say that they're actually not a very significant actor because no matter what you do, they will hate you anyway, right? It's the moderates who are the key players here in today's debate. People who are unsure if terrorism is a valid and legitimate means to actually forward your particular cause. People who are unsure if you're supposed to actually support a terrorist organization or not. Terrorism, ladies and gentlemen, is an international crime which warrants the highest form of condemnation. UN resolution use it as an international crime, ladies and gentlemen, as a use against Madam Chair. We say therefore that we're not supposed to support terrorism regardless of whatever the just cause it is because of the kind of impact it has in international order and the harm that it has. What the only thing which they do is try to create a sympathy for terrorism. Yes, it's true that somebody who killed a rapist for whatever just cause is not somebody who actually probably did it for a reason. But we don't think that killing is the proper method for you to actually do. You're not supposed to use it. Take the law in your own hands. It's particularly dangerous now that ISIS is recruiting a lot of people through media. That's the reason why you actually have to depict it as a forward thing. But secondly, it legitimizes the use of terrorism as a method to air your particular grievances. Now, for example, when there are a lot of environmental terrorists, people who actually think that the best way that they can actually forward their environmental goals is through terrorism. These are people who will be encouraged by it. People who are so furious with the way the US government are actually acting. People who are actually using, for example, gun shooting as a means to air their grievances against society in general will be legitimized because they think that your cause can particularly legitimize the method that you're using. This is a danger to society which we do not want to consent to. This is a danger to society which we do not want to propagate. Having said all those things, it's quite new, negative bench is going to win today's debate. See you in the breaks. Thank you.
Okay, Governor Wood.
Madam Speaker, all events have causations. The problem that we have so far, up to this point, is that the Western media has conveniently started the timeline when they hit us. The question that we really must ask is that why is Palestine attacking Israel? Because if you go back to the First World War, think about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration. There used to be a Palestine before there was an Israel. There was a reason why Palestinians are angry. They're angry at the French and the British that have betrayed their trust by joining the First World War and promising back their land. Instead, they gave it to Israel. That's why they're angry. So that's why they're also angry at Europe, not only at Israelis. But we conveniently leave that out. When we think about why the Middle East is angry about the invasion of Iraq, we conveniently leave out that the CIA during the 1970s planted Saddam Hussein in Iraq when it had a peaceful government because we needed a strong man to fight back against the Cold War. We conveniently leave that out. We start the narrative by saying that we liberated you from a dictator, but victims have long memories. They remember who put that dictator there in the first place. And we believe that when we say that there are just causes, we don't mean that the cause is necessarily the same thing as the action. Is killing innocent civilians a bad thing? Guess why we call it criminals? Because they did break the law. But do they have just causes, as in justified reasons why they had to resort to those crimes? And more importantly, the reason why the Western media must do this is because we provided those causes. Their just causes are a reflection of our wrongdoings. and only through acceptance that yes, you have done us wrong, but we will no longer propagate our own propaganda through Fox News Network. They're infallible. America does nothing wrong. In the past, we were able to do this because we're too powerful and we didn't have to apologize. And today, because, well, 9/11 happened, so we don't have to think about it. We believe that atonement, that the acceptance that both sides have grievances, and the acceptance by the West, because the West caused it, not Asia, but the West that has divided these regions, that have caused these grievances, are the reason why we, as the West, must do it. They talk about Al-Qaeda. They said that two things. Let's assume that these are crazy people that have no other reason but they want to kill people. Then leave them out. Because we don't think that a subgroup is bad, justifies not dealing with the holistic aspects of the general issue. But the second thing is, the first speaker said, I don't want to know why Al-Qaeda or IS has a problem. I'll tell you why Al-Qaeda had the 9/11 terror attacks. Ron Paul, in the 2008 candidacy, explained that there is a concept of blowback. When you occupy Mecca by holding hands with a dictatorship that of Saudi Arabia that the American government propped up because it wants cheap oil, Al-Qaeda demanded you stop supporting dictatorships that you propped up in the Middle East, you stop occupying our holy lands, and we'll also stop. You don't want to know, and that's the propaganda on your side as well. You talk of propaganda, but the current Western media does its own version of propaganda itself. We did nothing wrong. It is time that the Western governments say that we both agree that there are balanced views on both sides. If there is any bias, it's on you. We also like to talk about the propaganda itself. She says as if that we are fine. We have already handfuls of terrorist attacks, both domestically and foreign, with or without this motion. And she says that this is going to be further propaganda. Here's what the propaganda is. Brothers and sisters of the Islamic faith, you have grievances caused by the West, and the West will deny that they have any cause. This is why, before you were an American, before you were Britain, before you were French, you were Muslim, you must fight against those that do not accept that they have done any wrong to our Muslim brothers. This is the propaganda they send. When the media says, no, we will atone to our sins, we will accept the history, place it down. When we say that we also accept the fact, we will apologize. And if you don't really understand why this is an important concept, just simply think about how Koreans are so obsessed about Japan accepting that there was a problem. Japan has done something wrong. Accept it in your media so that you will be able to properly have conduction of equal good measures. You will be able to understand these people as well.
First one. If the United States will start to atone, it's a position of weakness. You're showing that the West is already bowing down. That's the reason why you're deciding to forgive, to say that we have to be forgiven because all the things are being permitted. It's a single.
Please sit down, George W. Bush. They're not saying that we're going to forgive them. They never forgave us because we have done things that caused their grievances, and we are arrogant enough to say we don't have to care about it. The Western media doing this is crucial. Not just the news. If you look at Homeland, if you look at 24, if you look at any movie, if you look at any Bond movie, the terrorists are the new Soviets. We just simply say that they're bad because they're bad. They hate our freedoms. They hate our wealth. That is not the reason why they hate us. They hate us because there is historical grievances. The only people in the world today that do not have their past grievances accepted and talked about because West history has a bad, like skeleton leaving in the closet of their fuck-ups, of their betrayal. That is the reason why they are still the only ones that are grieving. We negate the propaganda. We say we accept our faults. That's where the anger goes down. That's where, when we say we have done wrong by killing innocent civilians with drones, that's when the anger goes down. When we say that we have conducted historical past, we have overthrown the democratically elected government of Iran, we are sorry. That's when that anger goes down. We must be able to do this by not necessarily accepting their methods, but accepting that they have just causes. Causes we cause. That is where the grievances disappear. That's when negotiations happen. That's when we have a dialogue. That's why the West must do it, because the West has a responsibility. One, we have responsibility because we caused it. But two, never refute it. we also have responsibility because we are the only ones that can bring about change.
Yes.
Never dealt with is our speaker's point that the West are also crucial in practically implementing these changes. The two-state solution, the peace in the Middle East, by not propping up dictators. We told you that the current Western governments are not able to do that because the current narrative of the people is, if you do that, you're an unpatriotic person. You're not American. You know, Bill O'Reilly will probably shoot you down. By having the zeitgeist where the people also have the confidence and the informed consent of saying our governments must change is when that reality will also happen. Change the Middle East. Change the American people. Change the reality that we have to live. We already are living in a terrorist hellhole anyway. Nothing gets any better anyway by not supporting the motion. Thank you.
Okay, let's invite the Operation Representative here.
Madam Speaker, I'll run a pretty much classic group speech rather than more of a public speaking. Because when we were blamed for unresponsiveness, we haven't heard any forms of active response to the positive materials that were contributed by the opposition team. So through the clashes, I will deal with where there was no response and where there was response to the government side. So there were three major issues. Firstly, should media report to the extent to justify these terrorists? Second, can it be justified? Can terrorism ever be justified? And lastly, what resolves terrorism in a better, more effective way? So on the first issue, should media report to the extent to justify terrorism? Now they claim to inform. The reason why the government team fails at the first place is they have failed to characterize the gravity of their reports at the first place. Because when we hear the same, the reason why we say it's not mutually exclusive is the definition of the government team was too bizarre. Because it sounds like that the government or the media should report the facts, the causes of the terrorists, not the just causes of the terrorists. We are okay with informing these citizens with why these terrorists may have resulted in such drastic measure. But what we are not okay is to defend these terrorist groups and to support these terrorist groups because the measure that they have to use can never be justified. That's what we're saying. That is no different from status quo, and we think it's a too soft-line case from the government side. And we think if we are here to defend that media should never report about the causes or the background information about why terrorism occurs and whatnot, then we're more than proud to lose because there's no room for us to engage on, and there's no room for us to have a moral high ground. We told you from our very first speaker that those informations that they want is already accessible in many Western medias like BBC or The Economist. But what we are not okay with is economists actively defending these terrorists by saying that it's the Western government's fault for victimizing their own citizens because of the terrorist groups. You're disturbing me. But more than that, we think that informing itself is not equal to justifying for them. And we think that the characterization, the gravity of such information should have been better characterized by the government team. Secondly, we told you from our LO speech why the media should run under the legal framework. We strengthened that through our second speaker. We told you that it legitimizes the media itself when media claims that such drastic measure can be a viable option or can be an option to send a message to the public, or it may be the fault of the government because of that. And then they claim that we are suddenly becoming a puppet of the government. We think it's not an enough response. Because what we are trying to propose is that the bias the idea of bias is actually happening from the framework of the government. Because government team is in fact proposing that these terrorist acts are in a biased format. These terrorist acts was in fact a justifiable measure for them to actually act. Because the blame is actually on us. Blame is actually on the government of us, and citizens are in fact harmed because of their government. Then the second justification they use, that the citizens are viewed equal to the government, therefore they become targets. We think that's ridiculous. We think that in fact it incentivizes these people even more, because these terrorist groups have finally sent the message that they want to send. Now, the reason why the other legal grounds of talks and negotiation doesn't work is because it's under the views of these terrorist groups. Now they feel like, oh, finally our message has been transferred to these nations or to the citizens only after when we use a drastic measure. There's no more incentive for them to actually initiate a talk or engage in a talk, and we think that their message themselves was only transferred through drastic measures. Secondly, we think this will strengthen the propaganda that they're actually using. We told you the impact of this propaganda also, because that propaganda is oftentimes utilized as an effort for recruitment. No engagement coming from the government. Only engagement from Wisbit was that our side was the propaganda. That's not an engagement, Madam Speaker. We think you, teachers, should learn the lesson. Now, third of all, they say that public will change the view. We say no. We don't think public changes their view just because they know historical background, which are already prevalent in the status quo. And second of all, even if that's the case, I'll take you soon, so please be quiet. Even if that's the case, we don't think that it should be the media, but it should be the government. What they want is US government coming up to the podium and announcing that their historical past mistakes or wrongdoings was the fault. What we want from the Japanese government is claiming that what they did to the past Korean government was fault. What we don't want is media coming up front and telling to the citizens that you guys are suffering and terrorist act is in fact a justifiable act that they should act. We think that they have a wrong stakeholder analysis there, because what they're proposing is what government should do. Now briefly on the second clash, can it be justified? They say that supporting active violence and just causes are different. No, we say it's the same. We say it's even worse, because we think media informing enough is fine. But I need to really move on to my third touch. Just what resolves terrorism, because it's most important. They blame us for having no engagement on this anger radicalization. We engage to that, but we think the third engagement is necessary. We think that argument is ridiculous at the first place. But before that, I would like to take you, but I'm using the same trap measure. Okay, you can take it. Okay, so firstly, we think that we're talking about these extremist groups already. Within this, the reason why they form a terrorist organization is because they're already on the extremist side. The public resentment that they're trying to reduce doesn't work. It's not applicable in the case of extremist groups, because these extremist groups are already called extremist groups and they're terrorist groups. That's why we think that it's not about reducing radicalization, because these extremist groups are already pushed on the far right or far left side. But second of all, we cannot hold them accountable anymore, because we are in fact agreeing that their drastic measure was in fact an effective measure. Because finally when you use that measure, we, public, the media, start to notice what message you are trying to transfer to us. This means that there's no other possible ways for us to invite them to the talks and negotiations, because in their views of terrorists, the only way their message is effectively transferred is when they use drastic measure. We think that this will radicalize this even more, because these terrorist groups now finally feel that their messages are being heard by the public when they use a drastic measure. And in fact, media is supporting them by defending that their act was in fact justified, that the message that they're sending is actually a good message. But more than that, here, where our argument applies about propaganda, how we use propaganda to recruit these members, it incentivizes more recruitment, and we think that it doesn't resolve terrorism, but it actually incentivizes terrorism to strive even more, because now media is supporting it, and media is justifying for it. We think this is bad for the victims, and we think this is bad for the state. We're extremely proud to oppose.
portray, this is an easy win for the opposition. Why is that? This debate is about how do you lessen terrorists, right? That's the main issue that we have. Affirmative bench said that we have to portray criminals with just cause these terrorists because it radicalizes the radicals more, which means that they don't want radicalization because it leads to more terrorism. So we have to say, according to them, we have to say sorry by portraying terrorists as criminals with just causes. I've already responded to this. I've said to you that if you bow down, it only shows that terrorism is an effective measure, ladies and gentlemen, in order to make a strong government. You must, ladies and gentlemen, bow down to your knees, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, it radicalizes these people more because they know that it's an effective measure. But secondly, if you acknowledge that, hey, it's our fault, therefore we have to be sorry, then it also justifies or radicalizes the radicals even more because they know that the terrorism that they're actually doing is completely legitimate, largely because it's their fault anyway. We probably don't have to reflect towards their actions. They themselves already admitted that it's their fault, therefore they deserve all the kind of terrorism that we're actually going to do against that. Compared to the negative side, we said that the portrayal towards terrorism in order to end terrorism should be the highest form, the strongest form of condemnation in order for it to actually stand. Largely because terrorism is very dangerous. It actually can influence people's mind. The gun shooting, for example, in campuses is actually led me to believe that terrorism or airing grievances can actually be used, ladies and gentlemen, through violence if the cause is actually legitimate. If you think that you're being ostracized by society, maybe it's legitimate for you to actually commit terroristic measures. The bombing of MNCs, ladies and gentlemen, for environmental causes are things that I talked about which they never actually responded to. The killing of abortion doctors, some people feel is legitimate because that terrorist measure is actually backed by a justified cause. We don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that this particular justified cause should be used. And the only thing that you're doing is to say it's okay for you to do it because the means are actually legitimate anyway. But the last harm that I talked to you about is a danger that currently ISIS is actually recruiting citizens, beheading more people from the West, ladies and gentlemen, which is a legitimate crime which is actually being committed against international order because every single the international community is actually condemning it. What was the response coming from affirmative bench? Oh no, they didn't say anything. The only thing that he said simply is that, well, we disagree with dictators and what have you. Which brings me nicely then to that point. We agree that a lot of the things that affirmative bench wanted is actually really noble ideas. But the thing is that these are not mutually exclusive. You can have discourse, you can have information in the status quo anyway, right? There are backgrounders, for example, in BBC, where you can comment there if you disagree with that particular idea. You have links, for example, or references to other more radical or leftist ideas if you do disagree with it. You have pros and cons of the arguments within these two things, ladies and gentlemen. At the end of the day, we do think that they're completely unresponsive with a lot of the things which we actually brought up today's debate. What about the legitimization of terrorism and radicalization? They never really responded to that. The only thing that they said is that, there will be a lot of, and our justification of violence against civilians was never responded to. The only thing that they said is that we have to know that dictators actually committed a lot of crime. We do agree with that. They did commit a crime, and we disagree with the dictators. But you're using the same amount of violence which dictators are using, ladies and gentlemen, is something which is not legitimate. That's the reason why we disagree with the method that they're actually using. In principle, we also talked to you about the reason why the Western media should not support terrorists, because the Western media should always forward legal means or legal frameworks, regardless of whether or not it's actually quite feasible, right? Like negotiations, for example, and what have you. Largely because legal frameworks is always, the ally of Western media at the end of the day. So this is something that's also, again, they've never really responded to at the end of the day. So we see that a lot of the benefits of affirmative bench are not mutually exclusive, but the harms that we're talking about are actually against the self-exclusive only to affirmative side. The benefits that we actually portray in negative bench, ladies and gentlemen, is only exclusive to our side. That's the reason why it's quite clear. You're now looking at the top rate of today's debate. Thank you.
The problem is, in the status quo, as we have clearly shown you, there exists a major problem, right? We clearly told you there was a repetition of constant terrorist attacks, a repetition of constant oppression within the Middle East. And this is a problem that will continue. A lot of people will continue to die. A unless people change, unless governments change, right? And the only way to do that in the long term is to change the perception of people through the media so that government changes, so that then we can open a dialogue, a room for dialogue, a solution. That's how you change things in the long term. Under the opposition's world, you never get that. You constantly get portrayal of terrorists as being just terrorists, and therefore they continuously terrorize people. There is no dialogue, there is no negotiation. So when you choose today's debate, it becomes an essential question on which side which world saves more people's lives and provides a better solution to people. And that's something that we think the government side did better. Another important thing that we want to know is that the opposition unfairly characterized our team. We're not glorifying terrorists, right? We clearly said that we would condemn the act of terrorism, but at the same time that we would look into the causes of why they're doing, and if the causes are justifiable based on a look into history, then we would say that it is a just cause, right? We don't think just because we explain that in that way, it automatically leads to justifying terrorism, right? And that was too overly exaggerated and generalized on that side of the house. And we don't think that argument should stand. Another wrong characterization that we think that is important in today's debate is the essential characterization of terrorist organizations. And we think that our side of the house gave a correct analysis that these terrorist organizations are created essentially because of the grievances that we have caused. And if that's the case, their characterization that they're simply bloodsuckers and they just like to kill people, that characterization does not stand, right? And that's something we constantly emphasize, which is why when we implement our policy, when media starts to talk about these sorts of things, and when people's perception starts to change, that changes the incentive capitalism of these terrorist organizations, attacking less and also opening to dialogue. And especially when our citizens push our governments for dialogue, that's the kind of negotiations that we want to start to begin. The only thing the opposition basically said were basically threefold. Number one, they said that it's wrong to do this because this is a very, 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 very bad crime. You're justifying terrorism. I think I've dealt with that. We say that the important role of the media, and this is something that we've constantly emphasized, is to also address these kinds of problems by changing the perception of the people. And that is why we think that their role, which they simply said, is to reiterate what the government wants them to say, because in line with what the government is saying, is not compatible with what we think the media's role should be. So when you look into what the role of the media should be, we think our side has given you a clear moral stance of what a media should take. And that is why we also win that aspect. The second thing they said is that they can recruit more terrorists, right? This was one of the main cruxes of their case. But we think we also adequately address this point. But our second speaker, on which we constantly told you that this happens because they're angry of the status quo. They're angry that they're not getting acknowledgement of their mistakes, right? When they said it themselves, we don't want to apologize, we just want to say they're bad people. Right, that represents their case line and also represents the problem in the status quo. That's why they join terrorist organizations. And when that is eliminated, when they start to say that we have done wrong, and we have to revisit our policies, and we need to change, that takes away that momentum, right? Which is why we think our speakers have addressed that point extensively. And this is also something they didn't address, and this is our killer point, Madam Speaker, our second speaker, NC's point, which is that this kind of narrative is actually what allows our government to torture people, Madam Speaker, torture people through rendition and Guantanamo Bay, right? And the media doesn't talk about it. We think this also leads to huge problems that further promote terrorism. At the end of the day, it all comes down to that important question. Who addresses the problem? Who addresses the security problems that are currently happening in today's world? And that is something that our government tried extensively. We tried to give a historical example as to why they're doing this and show you the mechanism, the incentive why they're doing this. By analyzing that, we showed you a way out for our children, for our future generation.